Erev Tov, everyone. At the conclusion of this week's Parsha, the Torah lists for us the generations and descendants of Esav. The Torah did the same when it came to Yishmael. He told us his descendants and the tribes that came from him. At first glance, this seems to be superfluous because the Torah is not a history book. It's a book that's meant to instruct us, and it relates to us the story of the Ovos and the Imohos, who are the progenitors of the Jewish people. So all of these nations of Esav, so first of all, they're not identifiable to us. We don't know what happened to them. According to most Meforshim, Edom, Seir, they're not Esav anymore. What we call Edom, like the southern part of Israel, northern part of Saudi Arabia, piece of Jordan, has nothing to do with Esav. So what difference does it make? And the Torah goes into some detail regarding these tribes and these people. And it says that they had a king before the Jewish people had a king. Really, Rashi, the first Rashi and famous Rashi in Vayeshev, next week's Parsha. So the Moshel Apishtoni Azeh, this person that had a great deal of flax, and he loaded his donkey with the flax and he couldn't get it in the door because there was so much, the bundles were so high. So a man came and told them, let me use one spark of flame and all the flax will go up in smoke. So that's the moshel Rashi uses to deal with this. All of these great tribes, all of these nations, which in their time were very strong and influential, they all disappeared. They're not here. Not only that, they're not identifiable. It's one thing not to be here. It's another thing to be as though you never were here. That's a different level. And the same thing with the tribes of Yishmael. Now, what Chazal did is they took Esav no longer genealogically, but they took him symbolically. They did the same with Yishmael. So that in the Talmud we find that Esav, Edom, is Rome. That was how Chazal saw it. And they saw it in the relationship of Antoninus and Rebbe. And throughout, the Roman Empire existed for close to 600 years. We're not accustomed to such length of time. In our time, things go quite quickly. The British Empire lasted 150 years, boom. Russia went even quicker. The Soviet Union, other empires. The Austro-Hungarian Empire lasted 600 years. Disappeared. So that's the mashal of the Pishtoni. The Torah wants to emphasize to us that the great and mighty nations will rise and they strut on the stage of the world, and it looks like they'll be here forever. But the end is that they all have their downfall. There's a great question about the future of countries that we thought were secure forever. Doesn't appear to be that way. Either because of internal problems or external threats. And the Torah emphasizes that to us by describing all of these descendants of Esau, which to us are irrelevant, unidentifiable. But in their time, they were great kingdoms. They were mighty nations. We find in Tanakh yet that the kingdoms of Edom still existed. That's talking almost 1,000 years after Yaakov Avinu, after Esau. So that's one of the moral lessons that the Parsha teaches us. In history, for instance, I mentioned, so Rome became Edom, or Edom became Rome. When Rome became Christian in the 4th century, so then Christianity became Edom. And that's how it was always referred to in Jewish works. Now that gave the Jews a certain cover to say things indirectly in opposition to the majority culture of the time. So when they were accused in the debates, for instance, so they were accused many times of saying blasphemy against Christianity. So they said, we're not talking about Christianity, we're talking about Edom. And that's not, so it's not an accusation that we have to refute. But in the back of their minds, everybody knew who they were talking about. There is much in Jewish scholarship that if you don't know the context and you don't know what's involved, you will get the completely opposite understanding as to what was meant. One of my favorite examples of this is the introduction to the Aruch HaShulchan by the Rav of Navaradok, Yechiel Michael Epstein, in the 1800s, late 1800s. So he has there a paean of praise for the Tsar. You would think the Tsar was the greatest thing that happened to the Jewish people ever. And he writes so laudatory about him. But if you know the background, you know that he's writing against the Tsar, and he figures that the Jewish audience, the Lombish audience that's going to learn the Aruch HaShulchan is going to get it. That the compliment is not a compliment, and that the blessing is not a blessing. I've often told you the story about the two Jewish women that fought and cursed each other terribly. And the Rav couldn't take it anymore. He called them in Erev Yom Kippur. And he said, this can't go on anymore. from now on, whatever you say to each other must be a blessing. You're not allowed to say anything negative to each other. Okay, it's Erev Yom Kippur and they're stuck in the Rov's house and he demanded it from them. So they had to agree. Motzoi Yom Kippur, they're walking home together and one turns to the other and says, Bela, you should be blessed, but you know what I mean. So there's an element of that that has to be understood. You have to know what I mean. And the struggle with Christianity, it isn't quite over, but Christianity is not what it was. It has weakened greatly over the past century, continues to do so. And it's not so concerned with the Jewish people anymore. So this recording of all of these nations, all of these powers, all of these great kings that no one knows about. And that is itself the Musar lesson, if I can phrase it that way, that the Torah wants us to gather from all of this. And therefore, I'll list for you all the great kings of Edom and all the powerful tribes and all of the conquests. And you'll see that it's nothing, that it's empty. It doesn't have any lasting eternity to it. Masha'en Kain, which is not the case regarding Klal Yisrael, that always has the whiff of eternity that exists within it, and that therefore it justifies the fact that the past is not the past, but it's only meant to illuminate the present and bring us to the future as well. So this general outline is throughout Chumash Bereishis. Speaks of great people that disappeared, mighty nations that no longer exist. And you're supposed to come to the conclusion, but we're here to somehow record these events and understand it and hear it read in the Torah. So my final comment is that when I came to Israel many years ago, so my wife and I went on a tour of Caesarea, which was a Roman city. And there they've unearthed the Roman city with the Roman ruins and everything. And I thought to myself, if the Roman inhabitants of Caesarea were able to stand up, Tchias HaMesim, so to speak, and see who was charging who to see whose ruins, they wouldn't believe it. But that's Masim B'chol Yom here by us. And therefore, that's an idea that we have to incorporate into our thinking and into our behavior. Rabbi Chananya ben Akash Omer Rotza Kodesh Baruch Hu L'Zakos Es Yisrael Lefichach Hirba Lahem Torah Mitzvot Shenamar Adonai Chav Saman Sidko Yagdil Torah V'Yadir.